161, 162. Trouble, Snape's suspicion. A rather chaotic night passed quickly. Professor Flitwick never explained the real reason for gathering all the students, but Scott was grateful it had happened. Perhaps only the professors knew someone had entered the music room. Hard to distinguish truth from falsehood. Merlin Order headquarters attacked. Order members identify attacker as daughter of Slytherin. On Monday morning at breakfast, Scott laughed when he saw the front page headline. Almost everyone in the Great Hall was reading the Daily Prophet. Rita Skeeter has backed off, Eddie said. She used to insist Dumbledore was lying, but now she says it's hard to distinguish truth from falsehood. Roger shook his head. But the article still leans toward someone impersonating the daughter of Slytherin. She just doesn't dare openly offend the members of the Merlin Order. Downplaying the important stuff, Milton commented. She glossed over the attack's details and outcome and fixated pointlessly on Medea's identity. Ambiguous reporting like that will spark debate, Scott said. With Dumbledore and the Merlin Order's reputations involved, more people will start to believe Medea really is the daughter of Slytherin. Let's go. Milton stood up. First class is potions. Scott and Roger put down their newspapers and finished breakfast. They headed toward the dungeons. Roger, Caccini caught up with them from behind. Scott turned as she approached. Good morning, Roger. Scott Milton. She greeted them with a flushed face. This composed, gracious girl was suddenly shy and blushing, which surprised Scott. He gave Roger a teasing look. Cough. Roger cleared his throat awkwardly, then stepped in front of Caccini. Good morning, Caccini. Scott raised an eyebrow. Roger's behavior was uncharacteristically innocent. Good morning, Caccini, Scott added, smiling. We'll go ahead, Roger said, and he grinned at Scott before urging Milton to hurry. In the potions classroom, most students were discussing the morning paper. Many were disappointed there were no photos of the Merlin Order headquarters. This morning's Prophet only has that one report by Rita Skeeter about the Merlin Order attack, Scott whispered to Milton. Last time with Hogwarts, almost every page covered it. Why the change? If you hadn't pointed it out, I wouldn't have noticed, Milton said, frowning. After a thoughtful pause, he added with disgust, they're clearly doing everything they can to undermine Dumbledore's prestige. I heard. He lowered his voice. Minister Fudge was promoted by Dumbledore. At first, he used to write to Dumbledore for advice about everything. My grandfather used to mock him for it. It seems the minister isn't happy with his own standing, Scott smiled. Maybe he wants to be the greatest wizard. Milton laughed sarcastically. A man ranked 100th, even if he knocks out the first, he's still only 99th. I like that analogy. Scott chuckled. Milton's humor had sharpened. His yin-yang art was improving. Good morning, Scott Milton. Cedric came over to their desk. Good morning. Scott looked up, puzzled. Why are you so happy? Cedric beamed. I came to thank you, Scott, for telling me that learning method. You succeeded? Scott asked, surprised. Had Cedric really gained a sense of magic perception from the method he'd taught? Cedric nodded eagerly. Yes, it's a bit blurry, but I did it. My transfigurations improved a lot, too. Congratulations. Scott was genuinely pleased. His method had actually helped. Cedric looked extremely grateful. No need to thank me, Scott said politely. It's your own hard work. No, it's because you told me. Quiet. Snape's voice cut through the chatter from the back of the classroom. Cedric gave Scott an apologetic look and hurried back to his seat. Scott secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Cedric's blunt sincerity was hard to handle sometimes, and Snape's timing had been perfect. Snape strode down the aisle and, passing Scott's desk, gave him a deliberately sharp look. Scott felt the weight of his gaze, but kept his head down and didn't meet his eyes. Snape snorted, then moved to the front and, without preamble, waved his wand. Chalk flew across the board in neat writing. Everyone, Snape tapped the blackboard with his wand. Look here. Scott obeyed and looked up, meeting Snape's eyes for a moment. Cunning, worthy of the Serpent King of Slytherin. But by the time Snape had entered the classroom, Scott had already begun running a clumency, and after that period of practice, his skills had improved a lot. He still couldn't fabricate convincing false thoughts for a skilled legilimens, but he could now block legilimency entirely. They held each other's gaze briefly. Scott shifted his eyes away and picked up his quill to copy the notes. Snape said little and began the lesson. Scott understood why Snape suspected him. The occlumency. After Travers's death, Scott had no choice but to learn occlumency to guard against Snape's legilimency. When Snape detected he was using occlumency, suspicion followed naturally. Suspicion meant trouble. Scott had already been through enough to know he couldn't keep everything flawless forever. Small details and coincidences only deepened Snape's doubts. Unless Scott's occlumency rose to Snape's level, enough to fool even Lord Voldemort, this problem had no easy solution. Fortunately, their mutual understanding made it manageable for now. Snape could only suspect. He couldn't prove Scott was using occlumency. He couldn't publicly accuse Scott or admit to using legilimency on a student. Such actions would be improper, even illegal for a professor. 162, 163. Arithmancy, Professor Victor during potions. Scott had caught Snape's eye more than once and had to keep using occlumency to block the professor's probing. He breathed a small sigh of relief as he left the classroom. The next period was for electives. After waving goodbye to Milton, Scott went on his own to arithmancy. Arithmancy is a form of numerology that uses numbers to interpret a person's character and destiny or to forecast the future. Unlike Trelawney's divination, which relies on innate sight and reading vague symbols in tea leaves, crystal balls, or palm lines, arithmancy rests on a system of rules and careful calculation. It felt closer to mathematics and big data inference than to prophetic vision, areas Scott understood and enjoyed. Still, after that day's class, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been underestimating it. After class, he found himself approaching the teacher, a tall, bald, awkward man with thick-lensed glasses. "Professor Victor," Scott said politely, "do you have a moment to talk about arithmancy?" "Mr. Trollope?" Victor looked surprised. He was the sort of figure who moved and spoke a little haltingly, all angles and stiffness. "Ah, about arithmancy." He nodded and without much ceremony stood and walked straight out of the room. Scott followed. Victor said nothing as he led him down the corridor to his office, pushed the door open, and strode in. The office was a mess, mounds of parchment everywhere. Scott wove between paper piles like someone navigating a maze until they reached the desk. Victor set down the book he'd been holding, glanced around, and scratched his head. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked, awkwardly. "I'm sorry. I don't get visitors often. I'm not even sure where my teapot is." "No trouble, Professor." Scott smiled and declined. Victor sat, then tapped his wand on the desk. With a whoosh, countless parchments rose and drifted into the air. A few arranged themselves end to end into a long scroll near the desk, while the rest fell back into the piles. A quill from the inkwell flew up and began to write a series of numbers across the scroll. Victor relaxed visibly and let out a small exhale. He blinked, as if he'd forgotten Scott was there. "Excuse me," he said, a little stiffly. "I was working on a difficult problem before class. I can't seem to rest until I find a solution." "It's fine," Scott said. Victor nodded and leaned forward, peering at Scott over his glasses. "You wanted to talk? I remember your work in my class has been very good, Mr. Trollope." Scott decided to be direct. "After class today, I had a new insight about arithmancy. I used to think it was just logic, like Muggle numerical calculation, and that it couldn't do what divination does, because divination requires that gift." "No," Victor interrupted, a spark of excitement in his voice. "Arithmancy is not inferior to divination. My class requires talent too." Scott nodded. "I realized it's not just mundane math. Arithmancy is magic. It needs the right conditions, but given those, it can deduce things about the past and the near future." Victor's eyes brightened. "You've noticed that. I've taught here for over 10 years, and too often students never grasp the true depth of this subject. Arithmancy is profoundly subtle." Scott continued. "Divination can work without known conditions. Those with the sight can glimpse possibilities from vague images. Arithmancy, on the other hand, needs known data, but when you have it, the conclusions are more precise." "That is not wrong." Victor pushed his glasses up his nose, clearly enthusiastic. Scott added, "So while it might be harder to predict the distant future with arithmancy, the results it gives, when based on solid premises, should be much more detailed and reliable than the often ambiguous visions of divination." Victor leaned back, delighted. For the first time since Scott had met him, his motions were less awkward and more animated. Exactly, Mr. Trollope. Exactly. If only more students would approach it as you do. 163, 164. Scott's first arithmetic. You have already mastered arithmancy, this branch of magic. Professor Victor ripped a scrap of parchment from the desk and handed it to Scott. Try it, quickly. He sounded impatient. You're a fourth year. I finished teaching the basic methods in third year. Only students who truly grasp the meaning of this course can use it properly. If you don't understand, you'll only do mechanical calculations. He waved the parchment. Now, do it. Scott hesitated, then took the paper. Despite the professor's confidence, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Professor Victor handed him a quill. Decide quickly what you want to calculate. Be specific. Scott swallowed his nerves. All right. He took the quill and, on impulse, wrote the word parents. I want to know about my parents, their current situation. Parents? Professor Victor nodded. List everything you know. Scott added his parents' names and their current location, Spain. Write more known facts, the professor urged. The more detail, the more accurate the result. Scott began to write rapidly, jotting down every scrap of information he could think of. Within minutes, half the parchment was filled. Professor Victor watched him stop and said, Is that all? Now, using the letter number correspondence table you've learned, convert all of these conditions into numbers. Scott set to work, translating words into strings of digits. If you're proficient, Professor Victor added, you can write the numbers straight away when you list the conditions. Once the conversions were done, the professor pushed him on. Now start calculating. Use the magic we've learned. Scott put down the quill, drew his wand, and recited the one charm he knew for this class, arithmetic law. That charm, what Scott had learned in arithmancy, let a student bypass tedious steps if they truly understood the rules. The quill on the parchment rose on its own. Its tip skittered across the paper, rearranging and reducing the numbers. When the movement stopped, the paper held a column of digits, each one between 1 and 9. Very good. Now I will teach you true arithmancy. Professor Victor raised his wand. Watch my movements and repeat. He traced several smooth, intricate arcs in the air, then pointed his wand. Numbers manifest. Remember, he said, withdrawing the wand, as you do this, hold your purpose firmly, the content you wish to divine. Scott repeated the motion, trying to mimic every curve. Numbers manifest. His wand tip touched the parchment. The numbers on the page trembled, then stilled. Very good, Professor Victor allowed, but not precise enough. The professor demonstrated again. Numbers manifest. He looked at Scott. Activate your sensitivity to numbers. Scott found the advice vague. He concentrated hard, and to his surprise, something clicked. He tried again, eyes closed. Numbers manifest. A clear image formed in his mind. Michael and Amelia, his parents, and a whirl of materialized numbers spinning around them, rearranging and combining. At the wand's touch, the figures on the parchment stirred. In Scott and the professor's perception, the digits moved with purpose, colliding, canceling, resolving, until with one last convergence, all the numbers collapsed into a single digit. 6. It hovered above the word parents. Scott's knees went weak. He gripped the desk to keep from falling. That reaction was from the expenditure, Professor Victor explained calmly. You're not yet an adult. Using arithmancy like this costs more of you. Scott grimaced. I didn't expect it would feel like that. It will ease with practice, the professor said. Now, do you know how to interpret it? 6 stands for harmony, friendship, family values, Scott answered. At least that's what we learned in numbers and names divination. That's acceptable, but it's the textbook meaning, Professor Victor replied. Arithmancy should show more than that. The number's answer comes from the number itself. You formed a connection with it. A connection? Scott reached out and touched the 6, feeling nothing against the parchment. Professor Victor raised an eyebrow. Are you assuming perception is only tactile? Scott closed his eyes and shifted his awareness. He opened himself to magical sensing, and this time, the number glowed in his mind. He let his consciousness sink into it, and the sensation was like communicating, direct, intimate. Meanings unfolded, images, impressions, emotions. He stayed with the number until the sense of it was complete, then opened his eyes. Thank you, Professor Victor, Scott said sincerely. He felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the magic itself, relief. The number had told him what he most needed to know. His parents were well, settled, and content in a foreign country. For years, Scott had carried guilt about their leaving England, worrying they had been forced away because of him. Now that weight lifted. He smiled, feeling both accomplished and comforted. He had relearned a branch of magic, and more important, he finally knew his parents were all right. 165. The use of arithmancy. Scott left Professor Victor's office with light steps. All the way to the Great Hall, he walked with a grin he couldn't quite hide. By the time he sat down at the long table for lunch, his face still wore an unmistakably proud look. "Scott, what's the big news?" Eddie asked, and Milton and Roger looked at him with the same curiosity. "Ahem." Scott cleared his throat, straightened his tie with a small flourish, and lifted his chin as if savoring the moment. "From now on, you can call me Diviner." "Did you suddenly sprout a third eye?" Roger asked, bewildered. "No," Milton said dryly. "Scott didn't get into divination. He took arithmancy." "That's right." Scott remembered then that Milton had actually taken divination as an elective. "How's your divination going?" he asked. "My clairvoyance is a bit dull," Milton replied calmly. "Losing my musical talent set off a chain reaction I didn't expect." He shook his head and gave a slow, rueful smile. "But it's a price I should pay." Scott's smugness deflated. Milton smiled at him and added, "Seems you did something impressive in arithmancy. Congratulations." "Thanks, but it's only the basics." Scott pinched his thumb and forefinger together to indicate a very small amount. "Really?" Eddie's eyes lit up, and he adopted an exaggeratedly reverent tone. "Please, Master Trollope, help me calculate something." Scott snorted, but kept eating. "What do you want me to calculate?" Eddie feigned bashfulness. "When will my true love arrive?" Scott scowled. "You only like money, don't you?" "Who said that?" Eddie protested. "I yearn for wonderful love." "Sorry, I can't do that." Scott shook his head. "Arithmancy can't predict things that far ahead." "Pfft," Eddie sputtered. "Ha!" Milton and Roger burst out laughing, and nearby students joined in. Eddie, mock outraged, declared, "Fine. I'll find a girlfriend in a week to prove you wrong." "I'll look forward to it," Scott said with a practiced smile. "Seriously." Roger clapped Eddie on the shoulder. Milton nodded encouragingly. "Go, Eddie." The table echoed the cheer. Lunch ended amid laughter and Eddie's grumbling. After afternoon classes, the roommates returned to their dorm to drop off books and then left for their respective activities. Roger to Quidditch practice, Milton to the classical music club to practice piano, Eddie with his backpack to ply his underground merchant trade. Scott headed for the library to find the Gray Lady. "Good afternoon, Gray Lady," he greeted politely. She turned and smiled. Since reconciling with Ravenclaw, her expressions had grown noticeably livelier. "Scott, are you here because you have an idea about the diadem?" she asked. "I want to try arithmancy," Scott said bluntly. "Arithmancy? That could work." The Gray Lady raised an eyebrow. "But have you learned true arithmancy?" "I spoke with Professor Victor," Scott answered, "so I thought it would be worth trying." He didn't sound overly confident. He was being honest with himself, but he had decided that whether or not his arithmancy could pinpoint the diadem, using it would give him a credible reason to search. The more open he was, the fewer suspicious secrets he'd have to hide. "Then let's try," the Gray Lady said, eager. "I used to be fascinated by arithmancy. My mother was brilliant at it, but I never had much talent." She floated to a quiet table in a corner of the library and waited. Scott smiled, sat, unrolled the parchment he had brought, and set down his quill. "First, we should write down the object of the divination." He wrote the words Ravenclaw's diadem at the top of the page. "Good afternoon. What are you doing?" A few students who had been reading nearby gathered, curiosity piqued. Luna was among them and read the words aloud, bright-eyed. "Ravenclaw's diadem? Do you want to find the diadem?" she asked. "My dad made a replica at home, you know." Luna's remark drew more attention, and soon Scott was surrounded by Ravenclaw students. The Gray Lady's presence kept things hushed, but whispers still rippled through the crowd. Most doubted anyone could actually recover the legendary diadem that had been missing for 1,000 years. Some thought it a myth like Slytherin's locket or Hufflepuff's cup. Still, Ravenclaws were intrigued. This was an entertaining experiment either way. "What method will you use?" asked Ethan Cooper, a fifth-year prefect who had dueled Scott in the dueling club last term. "Arithmancy," Scott said. At that, The gathered students grew even more interested. They didn't expect a breakthrough, but they did expect an intriguing attempt. Quiet! The Gray Lady's sudden admonition fell like a curtain. The library went silent, and every pair of eyes turned to her. She ignored them and said to Scott, "Continue." Scott nodded. "List the known conditions." He began by writing 3 names: Rowena Ravenclaw, Helena Ravenclaw, and Tom Riddle. Then, following prompts from the Gray Lady, he added Albania, forest, and hollow tree. The Gray Lady murmured more details, descriptions of the diadem itself, and Scott carefully wrote each one down, including the inscription, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." He paused, thinking, then wrote 3 more words: Lord Voldemort, theft, hidden. The moment he put down Lord Voldemort's name, a sharp intake of breath ran through the circle of students. Inside the Ravenclaw library, the students watching Scott practice arithmancy recoiled when he wrote the name Lord Voldemort on the parchment. A murmur of fear rippled through the room. "Scott!" Ethan's voice shook. "No, stop it!" Other Ravenclaws began to shout over one another, trying to dissuade him. "Stop, Trollope! This is dangerous. Why would you write his name?" Some, pale with fright, couldn't completely smother their curiosity. "What does the diadem have to do with you-know-who? Who is Helena Ravenclaw?" Their urgent, clashing questions made the library sound like chaos. Scott frowned. It was absurd. Everyone insisted Voldemort could not return, and yet they trembled at the very mention of his name. "Silence!" he snapped. The Gray Lady turned to face them then. Pale light shimmered around her as she floated, eyes like rhymed ice, hair drifting though there was no breeze. "Quiet," she said, and the room fell silent as if the sound had been swallowed. "I am Helena Ravenclaw," she said coldly, "Rowena Ravenclaw's daughter." The Ravenclaws stared, mouths open. "You're Ravenclaw's daughter?" someone breathed. Another student opened his mouth to ask a question, but the Gray Lady fixed him with a stare that made his voice die away. "I always thought you were Lady Jane Grey," she said icily, as if correcting a misconception. The student fell silent beneath her gaze. "Do not disturb us," she warned, then turned back to Scott. "You may continue." "All right." Scott nodded, glancing at the faces around him, equal parts horrified and desperate to know more. He took a breath, steadied himself, and looked down at the parchment. After a moment's thought, he wrote the event and time when Lord Voldemort had first returned to the school to apply for a position, the first appearance after graduation, the most likely period for the diadem to have been taken. "That makes sense," the Gray Lady murmured. "That was when he first came back after leaving school. The theft is most likely to have occurred then." With her confirmation, Scott wrote the specific date range and then asked, "Are these all the known conditions?" The Gray Lady nodded. "Yes. Begin." Scott converted the words on the paper into numbers and recorded them with his quill. Students nearby who had studied arithmancy began calling out exact figures, and Scott found himself the scribe, jotting down each number. When the list was complete, he set the quill aside, drew his wand, and spoke the spell. "Arithmetic law." He touched the parchment. The black quill lifted and began to write the calculated results by itself. When the computations were done, Scott capped the quill and set it down, then laid his wand over the page again. "Number manifestation." As his wand touched the parchment, the numbers began to float, jostle, and collide. The assembled students gasped. "Is that a spell? Why didn't Professor teach us this?" Scott smiled faintly. If he had not had a sudden insight, he might never have seen arithmancy's true nature. That flicker of understanding, what some teachers called talent, made all the difference. He knew now that arithmancy required a particular magical perception. It could not simply be taught by rote. The numbers on the page dwindled as they combined and dissolved until only a single figure hovered above the target. 2, directly over the words Ravenclaw's diadem. 2, someone murmured. In numbers and names divination, 2 means interaction, two-way communication, cooperation, balance. It can also mean contradiction, another added. 2 opposing aspects, day and night, good and evil. Scott's mind clicked into place. Voldemort had used his gift for persuasion to trick the Gray Lady into surrendering the diadem and turned it into a Horcrux, the diadem's power to enhance wisdom twisted and fused with his evil soul. But arithmancy demanded more than a single digit. The precise meaning had to be read by someone with vision. How should this be interpreted? the students asked, all eyes on Scott. He smiled and touched the 2. He closed his eyes and let the number lead him. An image of Ravenclaw's diadem formed in his mind, a battered, tarnished circlet, abandoned in a room piled with clutter. A weathered statue of a wizard, pocked and stained, stood nearby. He opened his eyes, surprised at the clarity. "I saw it," he said. The Gray Lady leaned forward, eager. "You saw the diadem?" "Yes." His voice was steady. "Where?" she asked, urgency breaking through her composure. "Room of requirement." Facing the Gray Lady, who looked suddenly fragile with emotion, Scott said the words without hesitation. "Room of requirement." The Gray Lady's voice snapped. "How could it be? Is it really there?" "Whether it is or not, we'll only know if we go and look." Scott stood, tucked his quill into his breast pocket, and rolled up the parchment. "We have to go see." The Gray Lady turned and drifted through the cluster of Ravenclaws toward the common room door. "Make way! Let Scott through!" The students stepped aside obediently, and Scott slipped through the gap. Voices rose behind him, curious, incredulous. "Did you find the diadem? Can we come too?" "They followed him," someone breathed. Scott pointed back at the Gray Lady. "Ask her." She had already glided to the portrait of the knight opposite the door and spoke loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Open the passage." The painted knight frowned. "I only answer to Filius now. If it's you, lady, you may pass." "I demand to exercise the rights of Helena Ravenclaw," the Gray Lady insisted, sharp and impatient. The knight softened instantly. "Helena, you've come to your senses?" he said with a warm smile. "Of course, this passage will always be open to you." A hidden doorway appeared behind the portrait and swung open. "Go on," the knight urged. The Gray Lady looked at Scott. "This way." Scott hurried through. "Don't follow," she called to the students, and then added to the knight. "Close the door." The murmurs faded as the portrait snapped shut. The Gray Lady moved quickly, passing Scott and reaching the far end of the passage before him. "Hurry up," she snapped. Scott ran after her. At the other end, a door had opened into an office. The Gray Lady had already slipped inside. "Is this true?" a sharp voice demanded as Scott entered. Professor Flitwick stood mid-room, eyes wide. "You found the missing diadem?" "Not confirmed yet, Professor." Scott held up the rolled parchment. "These are the results of my arithmancy. I want to verify them." Flitwick's hands trembled with excitement. "I'll come with you." "We should find Rowena Ravenclaw first," Scott said to the Gray Lady. "I don't know how to get into that cluttered room." The Gray Lady nodded. "It's Mother's doing. The Room of Requirement is her creation. She'll know how to open it." "Then go see Rowena Ravenclaw." Flitwick's high voice squeaked with eagerness. "Albus said he'd been able to speak with her, but I never thought anyone could actually find her." "Follow me." The Gray Lady was already through Flitwick's office door. "Oh, I'll come too, Professor," Scott called, and opened the door himself. Flitwick hurried after him, but the Gray Lady was gone ahead. Scott led the excited professor down the corridor toward the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy and the Troll. The Gray Lady waited there. Scott paced back and forth 3 times in front of the blank stretch of wall. Immediately, the familiar doorway appeared. "This is it," Flitwick breathed. "A room of requirement?" "This is the room of requirement," the Gray Lady said with evident pride. Scott stepped forward and pushed the door open. A painting of a young woman brightened when she saw him. "Oh, good to see you, Scott." "It's good to see you too, Helena," Scott replied, smiling. The Gray Lady swooped in beside him. "Open the door quickly. I want to see Mother." "You're so bossy," Helena in the painting scolded, though she sounded fond. "You're the one who lost the diadem in the first place." "You," the Gray Lady flared, hair floating, then softened. "Fine, I'll open it." Helena's painted hand moved. A hidden door behind the landscape painting swung open. The Gray Lady floated through. "Rowena is in there." Scott and Professor Flitwick followed quietly. The Gray Lady was already chattering excitedly, explaining Scott's arithmancy results to the portrait of Rowena Ravenclaw. Scott and Flitwick stood respectfully to the side so as not to interrupt. Rowena raised a hand to silence her daughter after only a few words. "Very good," she said, then turned her attention to Scott with a pleased smile. "I did not expect you to possess such talent, child." She looked him over appraisingly. "Truly worthy of being a child of my house." "Thank you," Scott said, smiling. "To be honest, I hadn't noticed it myself until now." Rowena nodded, then glanced toward Flitwick. He stepped forward and gave a proper wizard's bow. "Hello, esteemed Rowena Ravenclaw," he stammered. "I know you, Phileas Flitwick," Rowena replied amiably. "Helena has spoken of you. You are a popular dean. Students think well of you. A good dean." Flitwick's small frame nearly trembled out of delight. "Thank you, Rowena Ravenclaw. Mother, the diadem." Seeing Rowena Ravenclaw still speaking calmly with Professor Flitwick, the Grey Lady couldn't contain her urgency. "All right." Rowena gave her a helpless look. "I already know where the diadem is." "Tell us quickly," the Grey Lady pressed. "We'll go get it." Rowena frowned. "The diadem, it's in the room of hidden things." Her voice carried a tone of regret. "You may go and look for it, but be careful." The Grey Lady paid no heed to the warning. She turned and shot out of the study. "Scott, Phileas, hurry." "Take them with you," Rowena said to Scott and Professor Flitwick. "Be careful." Scott and Flitwick both nodded and moved toward the door. "Faster," the Grey Lady urged from the corridor. Scott and Flitwick exchanged a quick, meaningful glance and opened the study door. Dumbledore was waiting in the hallway, smiling. "Good afternoon, Grey Lady. Phileas Scott." "Oh, you already know the news so quickly, Albus," Professor Flitwick said as he approached. Scott glanced back to find that Helena's study door had vanished. "Yes, the Ravenclaws were terribly excited," Dumbledore went on. "Minerva had quite a job calming them down." "Sorry," Scott said. "Professor, we may have been a little hasty." "No." Dumbledore shook his head and smiled indulgently. "You did very well, Scott. At noon, your arithmancy teacher came by, quite excited. Professor Victor told me one of his students was a true master of the subject." Scott blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected the arithmancy master angle. Dumbledore's eyes were bright with pleasure. "I was half in doubt until this afternoon, when you proved yourself with a remarkable deed." He turned to Flitwick. "What an excellent young man. The accomplishments he has shown already are enough to astound an old man like me." "Indeed," Flitwick said proudly. "Scott is the most outstanding student in our Ravenclaw." Scott felt awkward under the praise. The Grey Lady, unable to stand it any longer, cut across both their faces and addressed Scott directly. "Quick, Scott, room of hidden things." Scott nodded and murmured the words that would bring the room. "I want the room of hidden things." He paced the corridor. Dumbledore chuckled. "I once found a wonderfully luxurious lavatory in here when I was in a hurry, and then I couldn't find it again." At that moment, a new door materialized in the wall. "Oh, it's appeared!" Dumbledore exclaimed. "Quick, open it." The Grey Lady urged Scott again. Scott stepped forward and pushed the door open. The Grey Lady shot inside at incredible speed. "Oh, how can we find anything in here?" Professor Flitwick peered into the doorway. The huge room was filled with all manner of discarded things, old desks, chairs, textbooks, toys, piled into chaotic mountains. A troll specimen jutted up, its head bumping the ceiling. "It seems, over the years, many students have discovered this magical place," Dumbledore said. "They found the joy of hiding things." They entered, gripped by the bewildering expanse of clutter. "Where is it?" the Grey Lady demanded as she materialized among the heaps. She turned to Scott. "Scott, where is the diadem?" she added to Flitwick. "Or you could use Accio." "Better not," Scott said, stopping Flitwick's step. "The diadem is not right. That thing has been made evil." "What?" The Grey Lady's eyes widened. "How could that be?" "Remember?" Scott reminded her. "Rowena warned us to be careful." "Oh," the Grey Lady's shoulders slumped. "Still, come with me. Perhaps the two professors will have a way." They threaded through the maze of junk until Scott halted before a dilapidated cabinet. "It's there." He pointed his wand at a pockmarked wizard's bust perched beside the cabinet. Crowning the dusty old wig sat an ancient, faded circlet. The diadem. The Grey Lady floated over, leaning in to inspect the battered circlet. Tears and laughter tangled on her face. Her expression was a painful, complicated thing. "Ravenclaw's diadem?" she breathed. Flitwick stepped forward, but Scott raised a hand to stop him. "Something's wrong, very wrong," he said, speaking the truth of what his senses told him. "The diadem holds two very different magics, one kind, one extremely evil." Dumbledore's face fell. "Tom, he defiled this Ravenclaw treasure." "A Horcrux," Flitwick blurted. At that, Rowena Ravenclaw's portrait emerged from the blank wall beside the cabinet. She looked at the dusty diadem with a face that betrayed both sorrow and fury. "I never thought someone would make my diadem into a Horcrux." She stared at the circlet. Was it the Dark Lord, you mean? Medea's descendant? He forced his fragmented, ugly pieces of soul into my diadem. A Horcrux, Flitwick cried out. Evil, too evil, an unforgivable act. Dumbledore murmured, somber. When I confiscated that diary, I suspected Tom had made Horcruxes. That's why he could not completely die. He looked very grave. I fear the Horcruxes he made may be far more numerous than the two we have found. Filthy liar, the Grey Lady suddenly roared, fury coursing through her voice. Horrible riddle. He defiled the diadem. That wretched one, liar and thief and foul scoundrel. Helena, enough. Rowena's portrait intervened, gently but firmly. The Grey Lady collapsed into sobs, pressing herself against the wall. Mother, she whispered, clinging to the image of Rowena Ravenclaw. Dumbledore turned to the portrait, his features grave. How should we handle this diadem? He asked. Do you have any advice? Rowena Ravenclaw in the portrait glanced at Dumbledore, then beckoned to the Grey Lady, who lay curled up and softly weeping. Come here, Helena. Mother, the Grey Lady said, lifting her head slowly. Come here, Rowena repeated gently. The Grey Lady rose and floated toward the painting. A flash of white light, and her ghostly form vanished. In its place, Helena appeared in her youthful likeness, stepping into the painted room. Mother, she breathed, bewildered. Am I? Helena, my daughter. Rowena Ravenclaw embraced her. You will live with me in the portrait for the time being. Your painted presence can serve as your anchor. Scott watched the exchange with astonishment. As he had suspected, Rowena Ravenclaw could pull a ghost into a painting, an incredible strain of magic. Dumbledore murmured beside him, remarkable magic. Rowena turned to the three standing outside the frame. Please, she said, bring the diadem to my original chamber. I will find a way to clear the soul fragment. With that, the portrait sank back into the wall and disappeared. Albus, Professor Flitwick asked, excitement in his voice. Horcruxes, can they actually be undone? Dumbledore shook his head. I never knew, he said with feeling. It seems that on the road of magic, none of us can claim to have reached the end. He looked at Scott. It seems you have some understanding of Horcruxes, Scott. Scott nodded. Medea survived by relying on Horcruxes, he said. When I learned that, I went to study them further. Dumbledore did not press for sources. How do you view Horcruxes? He asked with genuine interest. They require splitting one's soul. It's like the liches in Muggle fantasy, usually irredeemable madmen, Scott replied. Splitting your soul is, to me, self-mutilation. The integrity of one's soul should matter most. Of course, Flitwick chimed in approvingly, and Dumbledore nodded. It's a pity Tom did not think so, Dumbledore added regretfully. He lost himself in the pursuit of power. That was his choice, Scott said flatly. He had no need to hide his convictions before Dumbledore. When the headmaster asked why, Scott explained, to gain power, the Dark Lord did not hesitate to become a monster. But I believe staying human is more important than power. Dumbledore leaned back, intrigued. That's a novel perspective, he said. So you think wizards and muggles are fundamentally the same species? Exactly, Scott replied. Like barn owls and tawny owls, different, but both owls. Oh, I like your analogy. Dumbledore laughed delightedly. Flitwick rubbed his hands together. We should send the diadem to her at once. Very well. Dumbledore raised the Elder Wand and sent the diadem flying through the air. They left the great room the way they had come. Back in the corridor, Scott opened the door to Helena's study again. The bronze knocker, shaped like an eagle, seemed to recognize him and unlatched itself as soon as he touched it. Scott thanked it and pushed the door inward. You've arrived, came Helena's voice from the painting, though she was less animated than before. Call me Helena. The Grey Lady was always a misnomer. All right, Helena, Scott said with a small smile. Come in. Mother is waiting for you. Helena glanced at the diadem, still floating under Dumbledore's control, and opened the inner door. Thank you, Helena, Dumbledore said as he stepped inside with the diadem. Scott and Flitwick followed. Place the diadem in the exact center of the room, Rowena instructed from her painted frame. Dumbledore flicked his wand. The diadem hovered to the center and settled onto the floor. You may leave, Rowena said. Return in 7 days. Dumbledore hesitated a moment, then inclined his head. Very well, Rowena Ravenclaw. We will take our leave. Flitwick looked uneasy and cast several backward glances as they departed. Once in the corridor again, he admitted, I would have liked to see how she removes that soul fragment without destroying the diadem. We must defer to her request, Dumbledore said, though he shared the frustration. Scott stared at the blank wall where the portrait had been. He, too, wished he could have watched the process. Professor Dumbledore, he asked, what did you do with that notebook before? It was utterly destroyed, Dumbledore replied, spreading his hands. Ordinary charms could not damage it, so I resorted to a very dangerous spell. Oh, Albus, what did you use? Flitwick asked, concerned. Fiendfire, Dumbledore whispered. Flitwick's face went pale. That's a perilous dark magic, almost impossible to control. Dumbledore's tone grew lighter as he turned to Scott. It reminds me of the night in the Forbidden Forest, when the young wizard Trollope faced a wizard casting fiendfire. He took a brilliant approach to dealing with it. How did he manage it? Flitwick asked, looking to Scott with surprise. Why haven't I heard of this before? Scott shrugged modestly. It was a clever trick. I cast a cheering charm on the wizard. A cheering charm? Flitwick's eyes widened. That is indeed an effective method, perhaps the best for young wizards. You always surprise me, Scott. Now, you need to go and comfort the Ravenclaw students, Phileas, Dumbledore reminded Professor Flitwick. Oh, Flitwick nearly jumped. Right, I must go. He turned to Scott. Scott, are you coming with me? Scott was about to agree when Dumbledore added, perhaps Scott can come to my office and enjoy a cup of sweet hot cocoa. All right, then. Flitwick glanced at Dumbledore and hurried off. Come on, Dumbledore called to Scott. Come to my office for a sit-down. You can also enter from the 8th floor, if you like. Scott followed him as Dumbledore turned left and right through a corridor and pushed open an inconspicuous oak door tucked into a corner. As the door opened, the lively chatter inside the office cut off. Oh, those are portraits of former headmasters, Dumbledore said with a smile. They always quarrel with one another when I'm not around. Scott glanced at the wall. The portraits were pretending to doze off. Dumbledore went to his desk and sat down, gesturing to a chair opposite. Sit down. He tapped the desk with his old wand, and 2 steaming cups of hot cocoa appeared on the surface. He took a sip with a look of pleasure. Scott took his cup, sipped, and relaxed. May I see it? Dumbledore asked, pointing to the rolled parchment in Scott's hand. That's where you recorded your arithmancy work, isn't it? Of course. Scott handed it over. Dumbledore unrolled the parchment and studied it carefully. Very talented, Scott. Very talented in this subject, he murmured. I know a bit of arithmancy myself, but I couldn't do this. Deduce the location of that diadem from the conditions you wrote down. He blinked. Usually, I use arithmancy to calculate what Honeyduke's quarter-time discounts will be. Scott laughed. Dumbledore's joke was light, but Scott always felt Dumbledore would be capable of such things if he tried. Dumbledore took another sip, and his expression turned more serious. Next, I need you to try to calculate something, Scott, he said, about Tom's Horcruxes. He paused, looking at Scott. Are you willing? Of course. Scott nodded, though he hesitated, but the known conditions are too few. It may not give any satisfactory result. I understand. Dumbledore put his cup down. What I most want to know is how many Horcruxes Tom actually made. I'd like you to try. It's all right if there's no result. Why not ask Professor Victor to calculate it? Scott asked. He should be more capable than me. Professor Victor has already tried, Dumbledore said, wearing a sheepish expression. Unfortunately, he couldn't get the result we hoped for. I see, Scott nodded. I'll try, but I'm not very confident. Dumbledore produced a fresh piece of parchment and placed an inkwell and quill by Scott's hand. It's all right, he said with a small smile. This is only an attempt. Scott set his cup aside and picked up the quill. First he wrote his divination target, Lord Voldemort, Tom Riddle, Horcruxes. Then he jotted down the only concrete things he had, notebook, Ravenclaw's diadem. He stopped, embarrassed. Sorry, those are all the known conditions I have, he said. They don't seem logically connected. That won't be enough, Dumbledore agreed softly. You need to understand Tom a little better. He began to speak, telling Scott what he knew of Tom Riddle. He started from the time, in 1938, when he, then a Transfiguration professor, visited the orphanage where Riddle had grown up to invite him to Hogwarts. Scott listened quietly as Dumbledore spoke of Riddle's past, checking the details against what he already knew. Dumbledore said Riddle had been born after his mother used a love potion on his father, and so he had been incapable of understanding love. Scott, without much grounding in psychology, thought perhaps Riddle had an illness, antisocial behavior, maybe, but he kept that to himself. Perhaps a love potion could cause such damage. Dumbledore's certainty suggested it might. As Dumbledore spoke at length, Scott kept the quill moving, extracting keywords and writing them on the parchment. When Dumbledore paused, Scott's sheet was more than half filled with concise phrases summing up Riddle's life and character. "How is it?" Dumbledore asked, sipping his cocoa. "Any thoughts, Scott?" Scott studied the parchment. "Riddle is proud and arrogant. From his personality, he wouldn't use ordinary things for Horcruxes, and yet he used a notebook." "He was only 16, Dumbledore said. "I think that was his first attempt." "Which suggests," Scott went on, "that the notebook might be the only ordinary item among his Horcruxes. The others would be things with meaning to him, relics or heirlooms." "You mean," Dumbledore said, nodding, "perhaps Slytherin's locket, Hufflepuff's cup, Ravenclaw's diadem. They're all possible. They've all gone missing." Scott added a few more words to the parchment. Dumbledore then related some rumors about those relics. Scott listened and recorded the details as additional conditions. He kept filling the sheet until nearly every line was covered. When Dumbledore leaned in to read, Scott began converting the words into numbers, assigning values and relationships for the arithmancy work. The parchment was so full, he had to write the figures very small in the remaining gaps. This part took him well over 10 minutes. Algorithm. Scott waved his wand to finish the calculation. The final step remained. He took a deep breath, flicked his wand decisively, and tapped the parchment. Numbers appear. The figures drawn on the paper began to move. Scott stared, frowning. Not good. The numbers shifted chaotically. No obvious pattern emerged. Worse, he found it harder than before to fix his thoughts. With his parents and with Ravenclaw's diadem, he had been able to form solid images in his mind. Lord Voldemort's Horcrux was an abstract concept and would not hold still. Scott pushed away distracting thoughts and focused on the divination. Whoosh, whoosh, the parchment trembled beneath his wand, and Scott closed his eyes. In his head, the numbers congealed into images, a notebook, a diadem, while more digits flew and collided in a wild storm. They tried to join and then shattered again, never quite forming a clear picture. After a long moment, the chaos began to separate. 4 distinct clusters formed, apart from the notebook and the diadem. 6, Scott thought. He remembered there ought to be 7. As he thought it, another cluster split off, resolving into a single new grouping. "That's all I can do," he realized, and decisively opened his eyes. Most of the moving numerals on the page had vanished in the collisions. The only remaining figure, once a 6, shuddered, and in an instant became a 7, then slid to the top of the parchment. 7? Dumbledore peered at the number. "That's a magical number." Heat left Scott's limbs. Exhaustion hit him like a physical weight. He had just completed his 3rd arithmancy of the day and felt utterly drained. He reached for the cup of hot cocoa beside him, but his wrist ached and the cup tipped. Dumbledore, with a quick gesture, froze the cup and its spill in midair, then righted it. He tapped the air with his elder wand, and a soft white light washed over Scott, easing some of the fatigue. "This little trick Pomfrey taught me," Dumbledore said, smiling slightly. "Only a temporary relief." He tapped the cup beside Scott, and the cocoa refilled itself. A straw appeared. Scott tested the temperature with his hand, found it perfect, and drank deeply. The warmth helped. He placed his right index finger on the parchment and tried to probe the 7, but after only a few seconds, he opened his eyes. "Very little information," he told Dumbledore. "The number only indicates how many Horcruxes there are. It didn't reveal anything else." "Very good. This is already very good," Dumbledore said, clearly pleased. "Perhaps you noticed the change at the end." "It changed from 6 to 7 at the last moment," Scott whispered. "I think Riddle intended 6 Horcruxes. 6 is complete for him. Adding himself makes 7, the most magical number. I suspect he did that on purpose." "But there are ultimately 7 Horcruxes?" Dumbledore looked surprised. Scott nodded. "Yes, and the 7th Horcrux was an accident. I don't think even he knew about it." Dumbledore's expression shifted at that, thoughtful and uneasy for a heartbeat. Then he recovered composure. "Very good, Scott. Thank you. This is of great significance. You're welcome, Professor, Scott said, managing a tired smile. I suppose Riddle's Horcruxes will also be targets for Medea, won't they? Yes, Dumbledore agreed, pushing his half-moon spectacles up as they threatened to slide down his nose. But you are a student. You don't need to concern yourself with that now. He waved Scott toward rest. Go, get some proper rest. Before Scott could move, the phoenix that had been perched nearby arched up and circled his head. The next instant, he was lying in a bed in the hospital wing. Mr. Trollope, Madame Pomfrey bustled in, dropping a set of hospital pajamas on the bedside table. Dumbledore sent word, change into these at once. She bustled out as quickly as she had come. I'll prepare your potions. That old wizard, he shouldn't be asking students to do things like this. Scott, stunned for a moment, did as he was told. Changing and settling into the hospital gown took him longer than it should have. When Pomfrey returned, she carried 2 small bottles and without a word forced them down his throat. Good. Now sleep, child. She drew the curtains tight around the bed. You'll be right as rain tomorrow. Good night. Good night, Madame Pomfrey, Scott mumbled, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the smell of breakfast awakened him. He blinked his eyes open to find the curtain pulled aside and Milton sitting on the edge of the bed, a paper crown perched crookedly on his head. Morning, Milton said. Scott stared at the crown. What is that? You have one too. Milton grinned and produced another paper crown. It's our little ceremony, celebrating the imminent return of Ravenclaw's diadem. Scott took the crown wordlessly and looked at the crude paper strip, the sort that comes with a birthday cake. Someone had written across it in uneven letters, "Wisdom is humanity's greatest wealth." Who thought of this? Everyone, Milton said. All of Ravenclaw's wearing them today. He pointed to a package on the bedside table. I brought you breakfast. Eat up. He stood, hesitated, and added, I'll ask Pomfrey when you can be discharged. Okay. Scott nodded and sat up, taking the sandwich from the bag. He bit into it, the bread and warm filling, reminding him that for the first time in a long while, something had moved in their favor. Occasionally making a scene. After getting Madame Pomfrey's permission, Scott changed out of his hospital robes and walked out of the infirmary with Milton. He drew his wand and, with a flick, reshaped the crude paper crown on Milton's head into a proper diadem. He'd changed only its shape and color. The material was still paper, folded into an exquisite origami-like diadem. Milton took it off and turned it over in his hands. So this is what a diadem looks like? It really does look great. He grinned and set it back on his head. Scott tapped the paper crown on his own head and altered it the same way. As they went downstairs, the corridors were full of Ravenclaws proudly wearing crowns. Today the house seemed to be walking with extra swagger. When some nearby Ravenclaws spotted Scott, they cheered. Scott, well done. Good job. Thank you. Master Diviner. But when they noticed the diadems on Scott's and Milton's heads, their faces lit up. Look, that's Ravenclaw's diadem. Oh, I want one too. Scott, did you make it? The girls stared at him with wide, admiring eyes. Scott smiled, produced his wand, and with a few quick transfiguration flashes, changed the plain paper crowns on their heads into matching diadems. That's amazing. So beautiful, they couldn't help cheering. Scott waved them along, and with Milton and a few classmates, headed for Charms. Whenever he saw another Ravenclaw wearing a crown, he'd touch it with his wand and quietly transfigure it, eliciting gasps and delighted squeals all down the corridor. Filthy Ravenclaw brat! Peeves appeared, sticking his tongue out at Scott. Why don't you make one for Lord Peeves? He swooped at Scott, snatching the diadem from his head with a snatch of wind. Ha ha! He pulled off his jester's hat and slapped the paper diadem on his own head. Looks better on Lord Peeves. Peeves, look! Scott shouted, and with a flick turned a suit of armor down the corridor into a small doll that looked disturbingly like Medea. Peeves's eyes went huge. He let out a high, piercing shriek and vanished in a blink. With one hand, Scott restored the armor. The diadem Peeves had tossed clattered to the floor. Scott caught it and set it back on his head. No magic in the corridors, he scolded, for form's sake. Filch came charging from around the corner at that moment, scowling. Caught you, you little... Good morning, Mr. Filch, Scott said blandly. Filch's glare wavered. Mandrakes, aren't they almost ready? Scott asked casually. Really? Filch's expression flipped to eager. I have to go check. He dashed away. You're really making a splash, mate? Roger clapped Scott on the shoulder as he approached. Scott raised an eyebrow and laughed, then turned his wand and changed the crown on Roger's head into a diadem as well. Sometimes being gleefully extravagant felt pretty good. Charms that morning was unusually lively. Professor Flitwick's voice was higher than ever, and he'd even altered his wizard's hat into a Ravenclaw diadem. After class, Cedric and a few Hufflepuffs came over. You want me to help find Hufflepuff's cup? Scott asked in surprise. Scott, can you? Cedric asked, almost pleading. Caccini stepped forward and clasped her hands. Please help us, Scott. Scott looked at her, Roger's girlfriend, then at Cedric, his friend, and then at the rest, familiar faces he wouldn't mind helping. Hufflepuff had clearly sent everyone they had a good relationship with. Standing there under all those hopeful eyes, he felt the pressure. All right, he said, I'll try. He wasn't confident. Don't get your hopes up, he added. Arithmancy requires known conditions. The more known conditions you have, and the more logically they relate to each other, the higher the chance the divination will be accurate. He explained how he'd divined the diadem. Rowena Ravenclaw's daughter appeared and gave me lots of details about the diadem and exactly how it was lost. I'd already guessed it was hidden at Hogwarts, and the clues I had fit together logically. So that's how it was, Cedric deflated. We don't have that kind of information about the cup. Scott asked, do you only know the usual legends about Hufflepuff's cup, like everyone else? We asked the Fat Friar, Cedric said. Even he doesn't know anything more. Maybe it's with descendants of Helga Hufflepuff? Scott suggested. Are there any known descendants of her in the British wizarding world? Everyone shook their heads. Scott spread his hands. Then I'm sorry, there's not enough to go on. I can't calculate it like this. Silence fell over the Hufflepuffs. A little way off, Scott heard Slytherin snickers. Heh, I thought he was amazing. Nothing special. Needs known conditions? Is that even divination? If you know the conditions, you can just guess. Scott turned and saw a small cluster of Slytherins who hadn't bothered him before. They'd been watching while the Hufflepuffs petitioned him. If he could locate Hufflepuff's cup, they'd have jumped up to ask him to find Slytherin's locket. Now that he'd refused, they relaxed into mockery. Scott met their sneers with a cool look and let them have it. He knew what he could do and what he couldn't without the facts he needed. 173, a failed arithmancy divination. Scott turned and faced the Slytherin students who'd been sneering at him. Is there something you need, Slytherins? A faint smile tugged at his lips as he regarded them coolly. We're having a conversation. What's it to you? One of the boys pushed forward, voice a touch blustery, but with no real courage behind it. I see. He gave a curt nod. My apologies for disturbing you. After that, Scott ignored them. He had no interest in engaging a few jokers who preferred sarcasm to a direct confrontation. He moved back to Cedric and the others. As I said, with the conditions you've given, it's highly unlikely I can calculate it, but if you want to try, I don't mind. Let's try, Cedric said cautiously. May we? Of course, Scott replied. They found an empty classroom. A few of the Slytherins tried to follow, but several older Hufflepuffs stepped in and stopped them. Scott glanced back at the small confrontation and then smiled at Cedric. Is it all right? Cedric returned the smile. It's fine. Hufflepuff doesn't like to show off, usually. This is different. Scott nodded, amused. Hufflepuff has always been the most secretive house, hasn't it? No, we haven't been hiding anything on purpose. Cedric laughed. Scott joined in. There were always rumors in the magic world, things like Hufflepuff is where you send the good-for-nothings, and Hufflepuffs rarely bothered to refute them. Underestimating the house was a mistake. Hufflepuff might not produce flashy headline-grabbing wizards, but they were steady, united, and quietly excellent. From appearances, only Cedric seemed a well-known standout among the current students, but Scott knew they had many capable people. Hufflepuffs were never short on members in clubs like Transfiguration or Charms. They simply didn't flaunt themselves. Scott settled at the desk and attempted an arithmancy problem. Predictably, he failed. With the information they'd provided, there weren't enough knowns to deduce the answer. The Hufflepuffs were disappointed, but they thanked him sincerely. Their over-earnest gratitude made Scott uncomfortable. For a moment, he almost considered telling them the answer. He knew, from the original work, where the Hufflepuff cup was, locked in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts, but he stopped himself. This failure had been partly deliberate. Even though the Hufflepuffs had asked him to try, Scott had planned to fail publicly sometimes. He'd been a little too showy after learning true arithmancy, and he wanted to tamp expectations down. Let people see that arithmancy wasn't omnipotent and that it needed stringent conditions. If others thought less of his abilities, especially those with no reason to help him or those who might want to exploit him, it would be advantageous. When Scott and the Hufflepuffs arrived at the Great Hall, lunch was already underway. He spotted Fred and George mingling with some of his roommates at the Ravenclaw table. Among a sea of Ravenclaws, their two red heads stood out. As he neared, the students stopped eating. A second later, the hall erupted in enthusiastic applause. Scott froze, suddenly tempted to turn and run. The hero of Ravenclaw is here. Let's welcome the hero. Fred and George leapt up and dragged him to the long table, pressing him into a seat and standing beside him to lead the cheering. Scott looked around at all the smiling faces and felt even more awkward. He stood, bowed awkwardly until the applause faded, and sat down again. "I can't handle this," he said helplessly. "No, you deserve it," Eddie said, grinning. "Perhaps all Ravenclaw should thank you." "That's right. You're our hero now." Fred put on an exaggeratedly fawning expression. "Great arithmancer, Scott?" George pretended to knead his shoulders. "You two?" Scott shot the twins a look. "I thought you were Gryffindors. Have you hatched another scheme?" "Oh, Merlin, we only want to congratulate our best friend," Fred protested, feigning offense. George kept massaging Scott's shoulders. What ill intent could the Weasley brothers possibly have? Scott took the knife and fork Roger handed him and glanced at them. "Do you expect me to believe that?" The twins took their plates and flanked him. "We did come up with something," Fred said. "It'll make a fortune." "Arithmancy?" Scott asked directly. "You said it," they answered in unison. "We'll open Trollop Arithmancy House. You do the arithmancy, we'll handle everything else," Fred explained. George attentively piled several chicken legs on Scott's plate and set down a glass of pumpkin juice. He leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "We serve you completely, Master Trollop. We only need 30%. "Hey!" Eddie's face soured at once. "That's enough, Weasleys." He looked almost ready to scowl the twins into another dimension. "Scott's my roommate. I'm the one who should run Trollopy Arithmancy House." 173, 174. A business that cannot be run as a business. At the dinner table, Eddie and the Weasley twins were arguing over who would be the best operator of the Trollop Divination House. Scott sat calmly, eating and enjoying the spectacle. He was actually a little surprised. Fred and George were usually so eloquent. Relying on their perfect twin rapport, their one word from you, one word from me routine had gotten them out of trouble countless times. But this time, they had met their match. Eddie, with his non-stop chatter, had managed to hold his own against both of them without missing a beat. "Don't think the two of you are the only ones who know how to do business," he crowed. Eddie pushed up his chubby chin and squinted at the twins. "I was already making money off the other kids in the neighborhood when I was 4. "We," George choked and turned to Fred. "What were we doing when we were 4? Fred paused, then said, "We nearly got Ron to take an unbreakable vow." "That was when we were 7, and Dad gave us a proper telling off that time," George replied. Fred nodded. "Ever since then, my left butt cheek's never been the same." Their loud voices set everyone around them laughing. Scott noticed Ron, who'd been eating at another long table, rush over, barely able to contain himself. Fred thought for a moment and then added, blinking, "Then, turning Ron's teddy bear into a giant spider?" "We were 5 then," George said, smiling as if enjoying the memory. "I still remember Ron's scream. 'I heard that! You two little monsters!'" Ron, now standing behind them, ground his teeth. "Don't you have any remorse? I'm your brother." Fred turned and grinned at him. "Oh, little Ron." "We were only playing a joke on you," George said. "An intimate brotherly joke." "That thing was a giant spider." Ron stamped his foot, furious. "I was only 3. Fred's expression went suddenly sly. "Wow. Actually, that was your fault, little Ron." "Exactly," George said. You were the one who broke our flying broom first. You." Ron's freckles went bright red, and he looked ready to tear into them. "Ron!" Harry came and dragged him back, and Hermione said with mock outrage, "You actually volunteered to be singled out? Now everyone can see they were right." Fred and George made a face at Ron from a distance. "See, Scott," they said. Eddie suddenly piped up. "Compared to these two troublemakers who only bully their brother, I'm more reliable. You should pick me." "Too slick, Eddie," Fred and George protested. "We have broader connections and can bring more customers." "Oh, we'll cater to you, Master Trollope. I'll even wash your socks," George added. Eddie scoffed. "Don't brag. You can't even wash your own socks." "We're little domestic experts," the twins began, of course not willing to admit anything. Scott, finally full, put down his knife and fork. "So what do you want me to do, Scott?" one of them asked. "Tell us your choice, Master Trollope." They all looked at him. Eddie, the twins, even Roger and Milton and the other students who'd been listening to the argument. Scott forced a smile. "Of course." He paused and then said, "I choose no one." "What?" Eddie and the twins froze. "Who said I was going to open a divination house?" Scott wiped his mouth. "I don't have the time." He stood up, and a chorus of disappointed sighs rose from the nearby tables, mostly from girls who were always drawn to divination. Scott smiled, glanced at Eddie, and then at the twins. "I'm full. Take your time." Then he left. As he passed the Gryffindor table, he couldn't help giving Ron a sympathetic look. The look only made Ron look more miserable. He clutched his head and groaned. Ron didn't notice Harry shrugging and trying hard not to laugh, or Hermione's slight smile. Scott walked out of the Great Hall and into the courtyard to sit in the sun. After a while, Eddie and the twins came out to find him. "Scott," Eddie began again, "aren't you really not considering it? I remember your parents went abroad. Maybe you should earn some galleons yourself." "Exactly," Fred said. "You only need to spare some time, once a week." "Why aren't you two arguing anymore?" Scott asked, smiling. "We've decided to work together," they said, and the twins put an arm around Eddie's shoulders. "I said I wasn't planning to open a divination house," Scott said, "but I didn't say I wouldn't make money from divination." "What do you mean?" they asked, eyes widening. "Divination isn't something you run like a shop," Scott murmured. "Think about it. Who would people believe more? Someone who opens a divination house to make money, or someone who only gives readings when they're asked formally?" "Oh." All three mouths opened. Scott added, "Which of those sounds more respectable? Which makes people more willing to pay?" "So that's it," they chorused, nodding. Eddie thought it over. "Even though this is a business, we can't treat it like a business." "Master Trollope won't give readings easily," Fred said, rolling his eyes. "He has to be dragged into it for the sake of his friends." "In that case, we can't have too many readings," George said, stroking his chin. "We need to screen who gets a slot and make them rare." "Very good." Scott smiled in relief. "It seems you know what to do." "Of course, leave it to us," the twins said in unison, bowing theatrically, and Eddie followed suit. Scott nodded. "Then let's talk about how the profits should be divided." When night fell, Scott was alone in the dormitory. Since he'd agreed to earn money through arithmancy, Eddie had been buzzing around like he'd had a shot of adrenaline, dragging in clients with the Weasley twins. Scott didn't want to deal with how they ran things. He only needed them to bring properly screened customers to him. Roger was out on the Quidditch pitch. After February, the matches between the four houses had grown viciously competitive. Every team was training at every spare moment, even into the evenings. Milton was at the classical music club practicing the piano. He rarely wasted any after-school time. Scott sat on the small sofa by the dorm window, turning a crimson gem over in his hand. It was the gift Medea had given him, a single-use philosopher's stone. He hadn't had a chance to examine it properly until now. With his roommates out, it was the perfect time. In his magical sense, the stone was an aggregate of very concentrated magic, constantly radiating fluctuations as conspicuous as sunlight. He rolled it between his fingers and studied it for a long time without making any progress. That didn't surprise him. Even a single-use philosopher's stone was still a philosopher's stone. If it were easy to understand, it would not be the pinnacle of alchemy. What really occupied him was whether to use it. Using the stone would produce a highly intelligent transfiguration product. In his vision, a fully manifest Raven Lambo would be a tremendous help in battle, an immediate boost to his strength. But it was a philosopher's stone. There was only one. Once used, it would be gone. He wanted to research it. If he could learn how to make even a single-use philosopher's stone, the profits would be enormous. And in combat, consumable philosopher's stones used sparingly could turn modern charms into something like turret-style sustained damage, concentrated spells becoming area effects, single-target spells sweeping whole battlefields. The thought alone made his mouth water. But it was clearly unrealistic. Something like this must come with a huge price. Otherwise, Slytherin and Medea would have exploited it centuries ago. They were not foolish. Tap, tap, tap. Glass chimed behind him. Scott glanced up to see an unfamiliar owl perched on the windowsill, its round golden eyes fixed on him. There was an envelope tied to its leg. The owl pecked the window glass 3 more times, as if urging him. All right. He rose, opened the window, and the owl hooted twice, lifting the leg that held the letter. Thank you, Scott said, more out of habit than courtesy. He reached into a cabinet, found a bag of biscuits, and set it on the sill. The owl eyed the treats, seized the bag with its claws, and flew away. Scott shut the window and unfolded the letter. Another blank envelope. Medea again? He slid the paper free and read, Dear Mr. Trollope, forgive my abrupt letter. My name is Katie Shafiq. I am a follower of Miss MS. By the way, I am not a member of the old Shafiq family. Those lines died out after the 1930s. I am a half-blood witch and only happen to have the same surname. Thanks to the great Miss MS, I am different from other purebloods. She does not look down on me for my bloodline, and I have found my self-worth under her patronage. Beginning today, I will act as your liaison. For your safety, all communications between you and Miss MS will go through me. Ms. MS has high expectations for you. She is very optimistic about your future. Please continue to work hard for Miss MS. P.S. If you wish to write to me, please send your letter via the Flu Network office of the Department of Magical Transportation at the Ministry of Magic. Katie Shafiq Scott felt a flicker of irritation. When had he become anyone's subordinate? Please continue to work hard for Miss MS. He read the line twice, then balled the paper and the envelope up and tossed them on the floor. He pulled his wand free. Incendio. The crumpled paper erupted into flame and quickly turned to ash. He opened the window again, sent the ashes drifting out with a flick of his wand, then leaned back against the sill and breathed cold air into his lungs. He would ignore the letter. Whoever Katie Shafiq was, Medea's follower or an opportunist, he would not be corresponding with her. He'd accepted Medea's gift, but it had been given to him proactively. He owed her nothing. He still didn't trust Medea's motives. Why had she left those 2 gifts for him? Was she really just praising him and betting on his future, as she'd claimed? Scott didn't buy it. Medea's obvious goal was full resurrection. What came next? She'd waited 1,000 years to return. Was recognition from Slytherin all she wanted? Scott suspected there was a deeper plan. If the letter was genuine, it meant Medea might already be planting agents in the ministry. Professor Flitwick had said Medea had once broken into the ministry, news the ministry had quickly sealed. What had she done there? It was another mystery worth investigating, but he had no leads. He pulled the single-use philosopher's stone from his pocket and looked at it until his eyes watered. After turning it over in his mind long enough, he made his decision. He would use it now. 175, 176. A unique ancient magic engraving method. Scott drew the curtains closed in the dormitory and sat down. He reached into the pliant, lizard skin bag at his hip and pulled out a slab of silver-white metal, titanium alloy. Titanium alloy, an advanced structural metal developed in the mid-20th century, is prized for its strength, corrosion resistance, and heat tolerance. Michael had acquired this piece through some channels at Scott's request. It was allegedly from the British Space Agency, though Scott wasn't sure whether that was true. He had already experimented with the alloy. Transfiguring with metal produced much sturdier results, objects that ordinary charms couldn't easily break, but the casting was far more difficult. Over the years, Scott had tried Transfiguration on many single materials. The easiest for him was ebony, the same wood as his wand. The hardest so far was titanium alloy. He hadn't tried diamonds. He wasn't about to risk his parents' wedding rings. Holding a disposable philosopher's stone in his hand made him bolder, and tonight he planned to finally put the alloy to a serious test. He would craft Lambo a durable body. Scott set the silver slab on the desk, took a steadying breath, murmured a charm, and drove his wand through the air. Transfiguration light linked the metal to the wand. Under that glow, the titanium began to deform, agonizingly slowly. Scott gritted his teeth and held the spell for nearly a minute as the metal inched into shape. When he finally lowered his wand, the slab had become a perfect titanium raven. The entire process had been painfully slow, another reason Scott never used metal as a transfiguration material in combat. No wonder no one made wands from metal. Its magical conductivity was poor compared to wood. He didn't intend to animate the raven with transfiguration alone. With a philosopher's stone in his possession, Scott was greedy. He wanted to try his recent work with ancient runes. But titanium was stubborn. Ordinary engraving methods would do nothing. Scott wasn't unprepared, though. He went to his bookshelf, pulled down a battered notebook, and flipped it open. The notebook contained several runic circuits he had validated through repeated experiments. A runic circuit, an arrangement of multiple runes, produced an effect far greater than a single rune alone. In the magical world, the most powerful artifacts combined complex runic circuits with alchemy. Unfortunately, many ancient and potent circuit combinations had been lost. Professor Babbling had told him that only the oldest pureblood families might still possess some of that knowledge. Travers, before he died, had said the trump cards of those families were mostly powerful, enchanted items. Those artifacts allowed pureblood houses to retain secret runic knowledge as part of their heritage. Scott had his own thoughts about that. Bloodline was often just a convenient excuse used to demoralize others. If everything were predetermined by birth, then effort meant nothing, an idea that helped preserve the privileged few. He harbored a dull envy whenever he imagined those families hoarding secrets. Sometimes he fantasized about stealing their lore. He kept those feelings to himself. He refocused on the notebook. The circuits he had mastered were simple and common, thanks mostly to Professor Flitwick. Professor Babbling hadn't held anything back in those lessons. He chose one circuit in particular. Lambo, as a small construct, wouldn't need frontline combat prowess. Scott wanted him as a scout and informant. Speed and concealment were the priorities. The runic circuit that boosted speed and granted some stealth was perfect. The next problem was engraving the runes into titanium. He had no tools that could etch the alloy properly, so he improvised. First, he took a black marker and carefully drew the runic circuit across the raven's body. The silver bird, now patterned with dark lines, already looked mysterious, but the ink itself was meaningless. A true runic circuit needed precise engraving and magical integration. Scott picked up his wand again and performed a delicate transfiguration. He concentrated his magic on the inked strokes and guided the metal, coaxing the drawn lines into shallow grooves. After another minute of painstaking work, he let his wand fall and, breathing a little heavier, ran a finger along the carved runes. The grooves were there, but they were only physical. They still needed to be bound with living magic. Without hesitation, he retrieved a disposable syringe. He plunged it into a vein, drew a full syringe of his own blood, then pressed a bandage over the puncture and rested for a moment. A wizard's blood contained magic, and Scott intended to use it as both ink and living conduit. He held the raven in one hand and the syringe in the other, moving closer to the enchanted lamp on his desk. Using the syringe like a pen, he carefully filled each groove with blood, stroke by stroke. His movements were slow and steady, and with each touch, he wove a thread of his own magic into the fresh blood, preserving its vitality. When he finished the final stroke, the runic circuit flared softly. The grooves pulsed with a faint red light as the magic integrated the blood into the rune, and the silver raven seemed to take on a new, subtle presence. Scott set the silver-white raven on the table. Its feathers were etched with dark red patterns that shimmered with a faint glow. The tips of its wings and tail caught the light with a metallic, silvery edge. While the blood on his hand was still fresh, he gripped the single-use philosopher's stone, the parameters he'd built for Raven Lambo surfacing in his mind, and swept his wand in a practiced arc. The Transfiguration charm flared from the tip of his wand, and Scott's limbs went suddenly heavy. The stone in his other hand trembled, then shook violently. He held on, and a blinding red light burst from his palm. The world tilted, his vision blurred. He staggered, took a few unsteady steps, and collapsed to the floor. The stone was gone. A dark shadow streaked past, circled once, and landed on the sofa. "Scott, why are you on the floor?" the raven asked. It cocked its head. Its dark eyes were almost human with curiosity. "I'm fine," Scott managed. He laughed weakly and peered at the bird. This was a beautiful raven, not a flat black, but a complex sheen of dark red tracery across feathers that flashed iridescent in the light. Scott scooped the raven into his hands, feeling the warmth of a real body, and eased himself onto the sofa. "Lambo," he said, smiling. "Long time no see." Lambo tilted its head. "Long time no see? Haven't we always been together?" Scott felt a wave of relief. In the settings he'd given the bird, Lambo had been with him from the moment it arrived at Hogwarts. The Philosopher's Stone must actually have given it memories and a measure of self-awareness. He couldn't help laughing. "You forgot," he said softly. "You were dormant for a while. It's February 1993. "What?" Lambo shrieked, shot out of his hands, and zipped around the dormitory in a blur. "No way! No way!" Scott slumped back on the sofa, admiring the speed. The runic circuits he'd woven into the bird's body made its movements leave after images. "Let me tell you what happened while you were out," he said. "Without you, I had a rough time," he added, beckoning. "I could have used your help." Like a bolt of black lightning, Lambo landed on the armrest. "Really?" It peered at him. "Then tell me. As your best friend, I'll help." It spread its wings and patted his hand like a comforting gesture. Scott began to recount everything, and Lambo listened, utterly absorbed, interrupting with little exclamations. "I can't believe you got to do so many things," it crowed, then flitted to his shoulder. "I missed so much." "You evolved," Scott said with a smile. "You've changed. New appearance, new abilities." Lambo flew to the mirror on the table and gasped. "Oh my, what happened to me? I'm gorgeous." It hopped and admired its reflection from every angle. Scott frowned, but reminded it, "You're faster, and there may be other abilities." Instantly, it was everywhere, a streak across the room. "Really? No one can fly faster than me now," it shouted, exultant. "That's great, Lambo," Scott said, clapping once. "Have you awoken anything else?" "Caw," it answered, slipping into the shadowed corner of the room and almost disappearing. With careful focus, Scott could still pick out its outline. Its concealment was close to a disillusionment charm, but a touch weaker. "All right," he murmured. Lambo popped out in front of the mirror again, radiant with pride. "Scott, am I powerful now?" "Of course," Scott told it and praised the bird some more. Then he leaned forward. "I need a favor." "Anything," Lambo said, flapping impatiently. "What is it?" "Go to the Ministry of Magic," Scott said. "Find Katie Shafiq in the Flu Network Administration, Department of Magical Transportation. Keep an eye on her." "Katie Shafiq," Lambo cocked its head. "Oh, the witch who wrote you? Is she your girlfriend?" "Of course not," Scott said. "She might be an enemy." "Enemy?" Lambo leapt onto his hand, all seriousness. "What do you want me to do, Scott?" "You don't have to do anything flashy," Scott said, stroking its feathers. "Just watch her without being seen, S'more. See what she does, who she meets." "I can do that," Lambo nodded firmly. "I'll do it." "Thanks, Lambo." Scott stood, pulled open the curtains, and cracked the window. "Go. Come back in a week and tell me what you find." He wasn't worried about Lambo missing anything. He'd seeded the bird's personality with traits from Eddie. Gossip ran through Lambo like it had been born to eavesdrop. "Okay," Lambo agreed cheerfully. "Goodbye." Scott raised his hand to send it off, but the raven froze, staring at him. "What's wrong?" he asked. Lambo looked ingenuous. "I don't know where the ministry is." Scott blinked. "Get an owl to take you." "No one told me about owls," Lambo chirped, then seized the idea. "Goodbye," it cried, and darted out of the window. Scott closed the window and sat back down. He'd sent Lambo off partly to gain an advantage with Katie Shafiq, but mostly to help the raven grow. Its memories and wit were manufactured, after all, strings he'd set in a program. Only by living, by piling up real experiences, could Lambo truly claim those memories as its own and become smarter for real. 178. The first customer of the divination business days passed quickly, and a new weekend arrived. On Saturday, right after the Ravenclaw-Gryffindor Quidditch match, Eddie dragged Scott into an empty classroom, unable to wait. "He'll be here soon," Eddie whispered. "The first client is a Gryffindor student. Fred and George will bring him." "Them?" Scott looked surprised. "But they just finished their match." Eddie waved him off. "It's fine. Fred and George said their Captain Wood's post-match summary is long and boring. They won't be staying." "I remember Roger saying the same about Bruce," Scott shrugged. "Seems all captains are the same," Eddie laughed. Not long after, Fred and George came in with a round-faced boy. They hadn't changed out of their uniforms and were still sweating. "You two are in too much of a hurry," Scott said helplessly. "Of course, helping a mate is the most important thing," Fred said righteously. He nudged the boy out from behind him. "This is Neville Longbottom, second-year Gryffindor. He's got some urgent problems that need arithmancy." "Hello, Trollope," Neville said timidly, nodding at Scott at Fred's prompting. "Just call me Scott, Neville." Scott smiled kindly, then turned to the twins. "You should know arithmancy isn't omnipotent," he warned. "Honestly, I might not be able to help this boy." At that, Neville's face fell. He looked as if he might cry and glanced desperately at Fred. "Oh, Scott, please help." Fred and George pleaded in unison. They begged for a while before Scott relented with a hesitant nod. "All right, I'll give it a try." He looked at Neville apologetically. "I don't want to make any promises or draw attention, and I'm worried my abilities might not be enough. I could disappoint you." It's all right," Neville said, blushing. "Thank you, Scott." "All right, you need to relax a bit." Scott's voice softened. "You three, go out and wait. Don't let anyone come in." "Of course." Eddie and the twins sprang into action. They closed the curtains, produced a small enchanted lamp from somewhere, set it on the desk where Scott would sit, then left and shut the door. Neville visibly relaxed as soon as they were gone. "Sit down, Neville," Scott said gently. "I imagine this is something you don't want others to hear, right?" "Thank you." Neville nodded and obediently took the chair opposite him. Scott took in the parchment, quill, and inkwell already laid out. Eddie had prepared them in advance. Scott picked up the quill and regarded Neville. "Tell me, what do you want to divine?" Neville looked up, then dropped his eyes. Scott waited patiently. After a long silence, Neville finally whispered, "My parents." "If you're very familiar with them, that's a relatively straightforward subject for arithmancy," Scott said softly, and he heard Neville let out a small relieved sound. "What exactly do you want to know? Their whereabouts? Their safety? Or something else?" Neville hesitated, then met Scott's gaze. "I want to know if my parents can get better. That's something an arithmancy might indicate, but I'll need details before I can try." Scott had forgotten many specifics from the original stories. He only vaguely remembered that Neville's parents were in a hospital. He needed to clarify the facts first. Fred and George mentioned, "You'll need to tell me as many known details as possible for the reading to be accurate." Neville's voice grew hoarse as he spoke, but he forced himself on. "My parents were both Aurors, Frank and Alice Longbottom. My grandmother says they were heroes. When you know who fell, they were kidnapped by Death Eaters when I was 1 year old. The Death Eaters tortured them with the Cruciatus curse. They went mad and have been in St. Mungo's ever since. My Gran takes me to see them sometimes, but they don't recognize me. They don't recognize Gran either." Neville told the story in fits and starts, clutching at memories because Scott had asked for anything that might help. "Mum once gave me a super bubblegum wrapper as a present," he added suddenly. "Gran told me to throw it away, but I kept it in my pocket." Scott felt a prick of surprise. Neville had a reputation for being forgetful and clumsy. He was the butt of many jokes for not remembering things. Yet here he was, remembering small, private details about his parents with painful clarity. The more Neville spoke, the quieter Scott became. Eddie and the others hadn't chosen the easiest first client. Neville's parents were clearly tied to the Order of the Phoenix, members Scott suspected, and if so, Dumbledore would surely have used every resource to help them. Yet they remained at St. Mungo's with no sign of improvement. If Dumbledore and the Order had been unable to restore them, what could Scott's arithmancy hope to do? He felt a pang of guilt at taking money for a service that might offer no comfort. What's wrong?" Neville's small voice pulled Scott back to the present. Can't you do the arithmancy? I'll do my best. Scott answered solemnly, deciding to be honest. But I must tell you, I can't guarantee I'll be able to calculate a result, and I can't promise what that result would be. He looked Neville in the eye. Can you accept that? Neville's hands clenched without him meaning to. I can, he murmured. Neville, who had kept his head down, finally looked up and met Scott's gaze directly for the first time since they'd begun. Scott searched the boy's tear-filled eyes and saw, beneath the fear, a hard set of determination. His perception widened without him willing it. He saw the color of Neville's magic. It surprised him. Maybe everyone's been wrong about you, Neville, Scott said before he could stop himself. You're stronger than most people. Neville blinked, surprised at the compliment, and gave a self-conscious little smile. People say I'm cowardly, he muttered, lowering his head again. Even my gran's always cross with me. Don't worry about that for now. Scott shook his head and pushed that aside. Do you have a picture of your parents? He asked. Arithmancy works better with a concrete image. Neville's face brightened. He rummaged in his robe pocket and produced a small tin, an old candy box, and opened it carefully. Inside was a faded photograph. He handed it to Scott. I sneaked this out from home. Gran doesn't let me keep it. Scott took the photo and looked at it. It showed the Lumbarton couple in their youth, smiling and waving. You look a lot like your mother, he said softly. Everyone in the family says that. A shy smile tugged at Neville's lips. Scott nodded and set to work. Good. We've got everything we need. Let's begin. He took up his quill and quickly wrote down all the known facts on a sheet of parchment as precisely as he could. One more thing, he added. Do you know who did it, Neville? Neville's voice wavered. Bellatrix Lestrange. The name came out like an accusation, edged with hatred. She used the Cruciatus. Scott's hand stilled for a moment as he wrote the name. When he'd finished listing the conditions, he converted them into numbers on the parchment. He drew his wand and intoned, Arithmetic law. Numbers, manifest. Two charms in quick succession made the numbers on the parchment begin to shift and flow. Scott closed his eyes and let the images form in his mind. The young photo of the Lumbartons, then an unfolding of time, faces grown older, expressions duller, hair gone white. Chaotic numbers swirled and resolved into patterns that hinted at what might come. It drained him. By the time he opened his eyes again, he felt wobbly. Neville was staring at him, biting his lip, barely daring to breathe. On the top of the parchment, a single final number had appeared. 1. 1? Scott said gently. It's not terrible. Please, Neville pleaded, louder now. Tell me. Scott rested his finger on the number and closed his eyes, drawing one clear conclusion from the arithmancy. When he looked up, he met Neville's expectant gaze. Neville, the result shows whether your parents recover depends on you. Me? Neville's eyes went wide. Yes. Scott nodded. The answer had felt implausible at first, and yet it made sense. Who else would be invested enough, desperate and persistent enough, to find a cure for the Lumbartons? Neville's gran was old and limited. Neville himself, young and unformed, still had possibilities. Whether the couple recovered would hinge on whether he could find the right way. Scott felt a sting of frustration. This was the sort of thing he could have guessed without casting arithmancy. But he also felt something else, an opportunity. Neville could change. He looked at the boy and then reached out, feeling the faint color of magic around him, and made a decision. Listen to me, he said. Neville looked bewildered, but attentive. This arithmancy says that if anyone can save your parents... Scott locked eyes with him. It will have to be you. Neville's face crumpled. I can't, he protested. I'm not good at studying. Everyone says I'm practically a squib. He babbled on, unspooling a life of stumbles, the shaky magical awakening as a child, the ridicule and the failures at school. Scott held up a hand. Stop. Neville fell silent at once, ashamed. Then voices from the corridor burst in, loud and indignant. Are you bullying Neville? Hermione's sharp voice demanded. Did you lock him in a classroom? No, we're helping him, came Fred's protest. Hermione's tone was furious. You can't treat Neville like that. He's not Ron. A disgruntled Ron added his own complaint. Scott felt his patience tugged in every direction. Come in, everyone, he called. The door opened, and Hermione marched in, determined and breathless, with Harry and Ron behind her. Her face registered surprise when she saw Scott. Oh, hello. Neville, are you all right? She demanded, hovering over him. Neville pushed himself up. I'm fine. You were mistaken. What were you doing? Hermione snapped at Scott, then looked at Neville as he answered. I asked Scott to help me with arithmancy, Neville said. Arithmancy? Hermione's eyes lit up. She was instantly interested, possibly a little envious. You're doing arithmancy? Scott, I've heard about your work. Congratulations on finding Ravenclaw's diadem with it. I'm taking the class next year. She leaned forward, eager to see the parchment. Before she could make out the writing, Scott flipped the sheet over with a polite, final gesture. Sorry, Hermione. He met her gaze. That's Neville's private information. If you want to see it, you'll need Neville's permission. Oh, I'm sorry. At Scott's words, Hermione flushed and muttered an apology. I didn't think. That's all right, Neville said good-naturedly, though he still looked a little flustered. He turned to Harry and Ron. Thank you. You were worried about me, weren't you? Harry smiled. Ron dragged us here. Glad you're okay, Neville. I heard you were taken off by Fred and George, Ron said, wrinkling his nose. I thought they were up to some trick again. Hey! Fred and George shot him annoyed looks. If you ask me, Fred grinned mischievously, we only tease you, little Ron. George nodded solemnly. It's an exclusive sibling thing. I'm not scared of you, Ron snapped back, reddening. Scott tapped the table. Since everyone understands what happened, he said, you should go out now. Neville and I have something to discuss. Can't we watch? Ron mumbled. No. Harry and Hermione hauled him toward the door, though all three of them, Harry, Hermione, and Ron, kept glancing back at the rolled parchment in Scott's hand. Neville surprised them by speaking up. You can look if you want, he said. He turned to Scott. Is that all right? Scott nodded and handed the parchment to Neville, rolling it up neatly. Arithmancy is done, he said. The next matters don't involve much privacy, so keep this for now. Thank you, Neville said, taking the parchment. Scott glanced toward the doorway and saw 6 people had formed a line outside, peering in through the gap and keeping the classroom door mostly closed. They were all watching him and Neville with obvious curiosity. He sighed inwardly and tried to ignore them. Turning back to Neville, he spoke quietly. You know the arithmancy results, Neville, but I noticed something else. You don't have much confidence. Neville clenched the parchment. I don't do anything well, he said. How can I save them? I've heard that, Scott said calmly. Your memory isn't strong, your grades aren't great, and you tend to get into trouble, both in your studies and in life. Neville's head dropped lower. You can't say that, Hermione protested, outraged. Neville's herbology is excellent. No, Neville shook his head bleakly. What use is that? Who says it's useless? Hermione snapped. Hogwarts has herbology for a reason. All right, quiet a moment. I haven't finished. Scott looked at Hermione with patient exasperation. She fell silent, still unconvinced but listening. Scott looked Neville in the eye. I say those things because I know your situation, and that's the root of your lack of confidence. His tone was almost conversational, which made Neville relax a little. Then Scott continued, and what he said next made Neville and the others startle. But I want you to know, Neville, everyone has misjudged you. Neville's eyes widened. What? Your talent isn't bad, Scott went on. It's actually stronger than many people's. How is that possible? Neville stared at him. The other students in the room looked equally disbelieving. Scott glanced around at them, amused. Do you think I'm just trying to console him? He asked. Their expressions all said yes. No, I'm not. Scott cut in. Your problem isn't with magic itself. He tapped Neville's chest. It's with your heart. Heart? The 7 others in the classroom asked together. The 6 peering in from the doorway muffled their surprise with their hands. Magic is the power of belief, Scott said quietly. Those are words Dumbledore once said to me. He looked toward Fred and George. Do you remember that afternoon tea in the headmaster's office? Dumbledore said that at the end. Fred frowned. Sorry, I don't remember that, he said. George scratched his head. All I remember is the desserts were very good. No, you remember, Scott said, a little exasperated. The twins exchanged glances and shrugged, then chuckled. All right, we remember, they admitted. Dumbledore did say that. Neville was still puzzled. I don't disbelieve in magic, he protested. Only Muggles don't believe in it. Yes, Harry said, laughing despite the seriousness of the moment. Like my aunt and uncle, till Hagrid showed up with a pig's tail on my cousin. Scott smiled faintly and shook his head. That's not what I mean. You don't disbelieve in magic's existence, Neville. He spoke slowly, choosing his words. You're resisting magic. Your heart is resisting it. I'm not, Neville said quickly. I've been trying so hard to learn. Hermione jumped in. I can vouch for that. Neville works much harder than Harry and Ron. This isn't about effort in lessons, Scott said. He called Neville's name softly, bringing the boy's attention back. Your resistance comes from deep inside. If I had to guess, there's fear tucked away in your heart. Neville's face went a little pale. Scott continued gently. It could be because of something in your childhood. Even if you don't have clear memories, your subconscious can still be affected. If magic once caused you pain, your heart might have learned to pull away from it. That resistance makes your magic falter. Neville stared at him, clutching the parchment as if it might answer him. Around them, the classroom seemed to hold its breath. Is that true? Harry couldn't help asking. How do you know all this? Of course I saw it, Scott replied. Saw? Ron repeated. How can you see that? Perception, Scott said. I perceived his magical condition, and everything I said was an inference drawn from what I perceived. As he spoke, Scott realized his magical perception had become a little sharper when he looked at Neville. He didn't know why. Maybe it was from studying arithmancy, or maybe from that transfiguration he'd cast using the disposable Philosopher's Stone, but he didn't pursue the cause right then. Neville's magic is not weaker than anyone else's, he explained. It's just less active. His magical inertia is strong. That's what's affecting his learning. So you think it's because of his mind? Hermione asked. Scott nodded. It seems reasonable to me. He paused a few seconds. Oh, by the way, there's someone even better than me at reading people's minds and emotions. She might see more clues. Who? Everyone else looked curious, but Eddie, who had an idea, spoke first. Are you talking about Luna? He blurted. His face made it clear he half expected Scott to be joking. Seriously? That girl's always been a bit odd. Last term you said she could see emotions, and I didn't really buy it. Luna Lovegood? Hermione sounded surprised. I've heard of her, but she's only a first year. What could she do? Scott smiled. Age doesn't matter. There are always some witches and wizards born with unusual abilities. He glanced at Ron and the twins. You two should know that. The Weasleys, despite being labeled blood traitors by some, had a wide education and a folk knowledge of these things. Yeah, like us, Fred and George said, linking arms and grinning. We were born with extraordinary intelligence and humor. Don't listen to them. Ron made a disgusted face. Still, he accepted Scott's point. I heard Dad say there are metamorph magi born able to change their appearance and true legilimens born able to read minds, and he glanced at Harry. Parseltongue is innate in some, too. That's not fair, Hermione protested indignantly. It's not fair. For example, Scott said, a metamorph magus can change their form at will. You can imitate that with Polyjuice Potion, of course, but a metamorph magus does it effortlessly and without potion. Some things can't be learned. Hermione looked unconvinced. Professor McGonagall said even being an animagus can be learned. Scott only shook his head gently. Some abilities were innate. There was no easy answer for that. He looked back at Neville, who was staring off into space, disbelief written all over him, as if his life itself had become uncertain. Neville. Neville blinked and came back to the room. Oh, I can't believe it. He spoke haltingly. I didn't notice any of this. I don't know if I'm like you said. I don't know if I think like that. But we can try, can't we? Scott said softly, slipping into the role of counselor. Try to open your mind and see if anything changes. Try? Neville repeated, hesitating. Scott leaned closer. Only by becoming stronger can you save your parents. Neville's eyes hardened slowly. I want to try, he said. Please. Of course, Scott said with a gentle smile. I'll help you. He was genuinely interested. Just then the classroom door opened, and Eddie came in with Luna following. Scott, Luna waved cheerfully. It's lively here, isn't it? She nodded politely at Fred and George. How are you? She continued talking as she walked, addressing everyone in the room. Harry and the others exchanged puzzled looks, while the twins found her entertaining and grinned back. Come here, Luna, Scott called. Luna bounded over, her pale, protuberant eyes immediately fixed on Neville. "Oh, you're Neville?" She laughed out loud. "You're so interesting." She kept looking at him with the fascinated curiosity one might reserve for an unusual magical creature, which made Neville uncomfortable. Scott, however, remained calm. "Did you see anything, Luna?" he asked. Luna hesitated, then turned her attention to Scott. "What do you see in Neville?" she asked. Scott answered seriously. "I believe there's a magical creature in Neville's mind that no one else has seen. It feeds fear deep in his thoughts and keeps his magic from becoming active." "You see it too?" Luna's silver blue eyes lit up. She almost danced with excitement. "It sounds like you did." Scott nodded. "Inviting you was the right decision. This could be a discovery no one's ever made." Luna nodded, as if she agreed wholeheartedly. "But first we must help Neville drive it out. His case is serious." "Oh, let me think. I'll see if I can help," Luna said, looking at Neville with sincere sympathy. Scott turned his head and realized everyone in the room was now looking at Neville with pity. Eddie caught Scott's eye and, with a look, seemed to ask if that was all right. Neville swallowed, took a breath, and for the first time since they'd begun speaking, there was a determined set to his jaw.